Love is not just for this world. If you want to discover feelings that transcend boundaries, subscribe now. The scent of scorched metal lingered in the stagnant air, mingling with the acrid bite of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The battlefield had long since fallen silent, yet the echoes of war remained trapped in the ruins, whispering through the skeletal remains of a once thriving city. Fires still smoldered in the distance, flickering like the dying embers of a world that would never rise again. This was the fate of the conquered, devastation, pillaging, and the inevitable trade of flesh that followed in victory's wake. I strode through the makeshift slave market with measured steps, my boots crunching against broken glass and charred debris. The dimly lit space stretched before me, crowded with rows of the defeated, shackled, displayed, stripped of names and dignity. Traders wove between them like scavengers, their coats stained with grease, sweat, and the filth of war. Their voices rang hoarse from hours of shouting, advertising their wares to anyone with credits to spend. The buyers moved in a slow, deliberate dance, inspecting the merchandise with the detached scrutiny of those who no longer saw people, only commodities. Most of the captives had already resigned themselves to their fate. They kept their heads bowed, their bodies still, as if motionless obedience might earn them favor. I had seen it before. Soldiers, nobles, civilians, it made no difference. Once the chains closed around their wrists, they all looked the same. Defeated. Empty. But then I saw her. She was seated against the far wall, her back straight despite the weight of iron cuffs around her wrists and chains looped tight around her ankles. The firelight cast long shadows across her face, accentuating sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw. Her clothes were torn, streaked with dried blood, but they had once been finely made, something woven for someone of status. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable, but it was her eyes that caught my attention. Green, burning, unbroken. She did not weep. She did not beg. She did not flinch under the scrutiny of potential buyers as they passed her by, dismissing her as worthless. She simply watched, gazed steady, fierce in a way that should have long since been extinguished. The dim light caught in her irises, turning them into twin flames against the backdrop of ruin. She did not belong here. A trader sidled up beside me, reeking of sweat and cheap oil. His grin was wide, revealing crooked teeth, his eyes quick and greedy as he followed my gaze. "Looking for labor or entertainment?" he asked, his voice slick with false charm. "Got all sorts here. Fighters, cooks, pleasure slaves. Even a few engineers, if you're the practical type." I said nothing, my attention still fixed on the woman in chains. The trader chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. That one." He shook his head. "Been sitting there for days. Stubborn thing. Won't talk, won't eat. Figured she dropped dead by now, but she just keeps glaring at people like that's going to change anything." He leaned in conspiratorially. "Tell you what, since you seem interested, I'll give her to you for half price. Barely worth the trouble of keeping her alive." I turned my head slightly. "What's her name?" He scoffed. "What's it matter? She's just another stray from a dead world. Some noble's daughter, maybe." He tapped the side of his temple with a calloused finger. "They all think their blood means something, right up until they end up here." His grin widened. Takes him a while to realize they're not special anymore. A noble's daughter. That would explain the fire in her stare, the way she carried herself, unbending even in chains. Yet there was something else, something beyond mere pride. A presence, a weight to her silence, as though she were measuring everything, planning beyond the moment. I had seen prisoners before, kings brought to their knees, warriors reduced to begging, but she did not look like someone who had accepted defeat. "How much?" I asked. The trader blinked. "Like I said, half price. 4,000 credits. I pulled a chip from my belt and pressed it into his grimy palm. His scanner beeped, confirming the transfer. "She's yours," he said, stepping back. "Good luck breaking her." I walked toward her, my movements slow, deliberate. She did not shrink away, did not lower her gaze. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, acknowledging my presence as one might acknowledge an inconvenient shift in the wind. Up close, I could see the faint scar that cut through the arch of one eyebrow, the slight tension in her shoulders, the subtle way her fingers curled inward, not in fear, but in restraint. I knelt before her, unlocked the cuffs at her wrists, then the chains at her ankles. The iron hit the ground with a dull clang, but she remained still, unmoving. "You can stand," I said. For the first time, she looked directly at me. Her gaze held no fear, no gratitude, only quiet calculation. A flicker of something passed through her expression, there and gone in an instant, and then she rose. Slowly, deliberately, testing the weight of her own limbs, the freedom of movement she had not been granted in days. I studied her for a moment longer before turning away. "Come." She did not follow immediately. "You bought me," she said at last, her voice smooth, edged with steel. "What do you intend to do with me?" I glanced back. "That depends," I said. "What are you planning to do?" A ghost of a smile flickered across her lips, brief, enigmatic. She did not answer, but she took a step forward, then another, and then she fell in a step behind me. I had purchased a slave, but something told me I had just invited a storm onto my ship. The Vanguard rumbled beneath my boots as I made my way to the cockpit, the woman's presence trailing behind me like a phantom. The air smelled of heated metal and stale coolant, the recycled oxygen carrying the faint tang of oil and old circuitry. The ship wasn't luxurious. Hell, it wasn't even comfortable, but it was home. And now, for better or worse, she was part of it. I didn't glance back, but I could feel her watching. Even without turning, I knew she was assessing every inch of the vessel, cataloging weaknesses, escape routes, anything that might tip the balance of power in her favor. She was good at hiding it, her movements casual, unhurried, but I'd spent enough time around dangerous people to recognize the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to survive in the dark spaces of the universe. I had seen prisoners before, beaten, broken, empty. She was none of those things. The bruises at her wrists, the raw indentations where shackles had dug too deep, should have made her look fragile. Instead, she carried them like old scars, marks that no longer mattered. There was no fear in her, no desperation, only the kind of patience that came with knowing the right moment hadn't arrived yet. The cockpit door slid open with a hiss, revealing the dim glow of instrument panels casting sharp shadows across the walls. My pilot, a wiry man named Reyes, sat hunched over the controls, fingers tapping a steady rhythm against the console. His dark eyes flicked toward me, then past me to the woman standing at my back. His expression didn't change, but I knew what he was thinking. "This the one?" he asked, voice low and rough, like gravel rolling through an engine. "She's got a name," I said, though I hadn't yet heard it. He grunted. "Might want to learn it before she puts a knife in your ribs." I ignored him and leaned over the console. The radar display pulsed with a single red dot, its trajectory locked onto us like a predator sighting prey. I frowned. "No transponder? Nothing." Reyes confirmed. "Came out of FTL 2 minutes ago. No hails. No response to scans. Just heading straight for us." That wasn't good. A ship running dark with no identification usually meant trouble. Pirates, bounty hunters, or someone who didn't want their presence recorded. None of those possibilities worked in my favor. I turned to the woman. She hadn't moved from the threshold of the cockpit, but there was something in her stance, something too still, too measured. I could see in the slight angle of her head, the way her hands remained loose at her sides, as if waiting. "You recognize it," I said, not a question. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze flicked to the monitor, absorbing the data with the ease of someone who had spent time around Starship navigation systems. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost detached. "They came faster than I expected." Reyes let out a low curse. "She's got company?" I folded my arms. "Who are they?" She didn't hesitate. "Executioners." The words settled heavy between us, thick with the weight of something unspoken. I didn't flinch, but I felt Reyes tense beside me. He knew the name. Everyone in our line of work did. Executioners weren't bounty hunters. They weren't soldiers. They were something worse. Ghosts sent to erase problems before they became threats. If they were here, it meant someone had paid a fortune to make sure the woman standing before me didn't leave this ship alive. My jaw tightened. You want to tell me why they're after you? Her lips curved slightly, a shadow of a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You already know. I did. Or at least, I had a damn good guess. Nobility didn't end up in chains unless they had something worth taking or something worth silencing. The trader back at the market had dismissed her as a mere noble's daughter, a relic of a dead world. But nobles didn't send executioners after their lost heirs. Empires did. I exhaled slowly. So what? You're some lost princess. A flicker of amusement crossed her face. If that's what you want to call it. Raise out a sharp breath. Shit, I couldn't argue with that. The console beeped, a proximity alert flashing red. The executioners were close now, too close to run without raising suspicion. I turned back to her. They're not here to bring you back, are they? No, she said simply. They're here to make sure there's nothing to bring back. I swore into my breath. This wasn't what I had signed up for. I had planned on selling her off, making a quick profit, maybe figuring out what made her valuable in the first place. Now, I was staring down a ship full of professional killers because I had made a bad call in a slave market. I looked at Ray's. Weapons hot? He shook his head. We're fast, but we're not that fast. If they decide to open fire, we'll be scrapped before we hit the drift lanes. I turned back to the woman. She was watching me, waiting the same way she had back in the cargo hold when I unlocked her chains. As if she already knew what I was going to do. I hated that. You got a plan? I asked. She nodded. Care to share it? The ghost of that smile returned. Let them board. Ray swore again. Great. I love dying in my own damn ship. I didn't love the idea either, but she wasn't suggesting it blindly. There was something in her voice, certainty, control, as if she had already played out every possible outcome, and this was the one that got us out alive. I didn't trust her. Not yet, but I trusted my instincts. And my instincts told me she wasn't ready to die. I reached for the comm fine. We let them board. Then, to her, if this goes sideways, I'll make sure you don't live long enough for them to take you. She met my gaze, unblinking. If this goes sideways, you won't have the chance. I wasn't sure whether that was a promise or a threat. Either way, the executioners were coming. And something told me that by the time this was over, I would wish I had left her in chains. The Vanguard groaned under the strain of the docking clamps, the ship's aging hull protesting against the force of the executioner's vessel locking into place. The air inside felt heavier, charged with something unseen, the kind of weight that settled just before a storm. A red light pulsed steadily above the airlock, casting long shadows across the metal walls. It wouldn't be long now. Ray's voice crackled over the comm, docking complete. We got 4 incoming. I tightened my grip on the console, my fingers curling against the metal. Weapons hot. They are. We're not. I exhaled sharply. Of course, they wouldn't storm in blind. Executioners never did. They weren't like common bounty hunters or hired killers who relied on brute force. No, these were precision weapons wrapped in flesh, trained to eliminate targets with terrifying efficiency. If they were on board, it meant only one thing. Someone had paid a fortune to make sure my unwanted passenger never left this ship alive. I turned my head slightly. She stood near the bulkhead, arms loose at her sides, unreadable. Not relaxed, but not afraid either. If anything, she looked like she had expected this, as if she had been counting down the moments since the airlock engaged. I tapped the comm rays, prepped the jump drive. He let out a dry laugh. To where? Anywhere that's not here. The pause that followed was long enough to make me wonder if he had already started saying his goodbyes. Then, finally he sighed. Copy that. I looked at her. Any last-minute revelations you'd like to share before we let them in? She didn't blink. They won't leave this ship alive. I wasn't sure if that was a promise or a warning. A sharp hiss cut through the silence as the airlock seals disengaged. The door slid open and the executioner stepped through. They moved with an unnatural stillness, their matte black armor absorbing the dim cockpit lights, their helmets blank and expressionless. No insignias, no markings. The only thing that set them apart was the way they carried themselves, like men who had never lost a fight. The leader took a step forward. He wasn't the biggest, wasn't the most heavily armed, but something about him made the space around him seem smaller. Controlled. His visor tilted toward me, then toward her. He didn't hesitate long. She's coming with us. His voice was calm, as if the matter had already been settled. But I'd spent too many years in this line of work not to recognize when someone was lying. He wasn't here to take her. He was here to erase her. She took a single step forward, measured and deliberate. Under whose orders? A pause. Almost imperceptible, but there. The executioner shifted slightly, his fingers curling near his rifle. A tell. She caught it. So did I. I reached for my sidearm. They moved first. A flash of motion, her closing the distance in the heartbeat it took for him to draw breath. Her fingers ghosted over his holster, slipping the weapon free before he could react. The first shot caught him the side, not enough to kill, but enough to throw him off balance. She pivoted, her stolen weapon firing again. Another executioner dropped, his knee buckling as the blast tore through the joint of his armor. The remaining two raised their rifles. I was already moving. I fired, the force of the shot slamming one of them backward. His armor absorbed most of the impact, but he staggered, his aim faltering. Before he could recover, Reyes charged in from the corridor, tackling the last executioner into the bulkhead. The sickening crack of bone, snapping, filled the space between us. Silence. The leader groaned, clutching his wound. The woman stepped closer, pressing the barrel of her stolen weapon to the side of his helmet. Who sent you? No answer. She tilted her head slightly, studying him, then exhaled softly, almost disappointed. Her fingers grazed the insignia barely visible on his breastplate, a symbol so small it could have been mistaken for a scratch. They really want me gone. I holster my weapon. Ooh! She met my gaze. The Dominion. Reyes let out a sharp breath. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The weight of that name settled between us like a gravestone. The Dominion didn't send executioners to retrieve people. They sent them to erase problems before they became threats. That meant she wasn't just some wayward noble. She was dangerous. I ran a hand through my hair. You've been holding out on me. She tilted her head, a ghost of amusement flickering in her eyes. Would you have believed me? I didn't answer. Reyes nudged one of the downed executioners with his boot. So what now? She spun the stolen weapon in her palm, testing its weight. Now, she said, we run. I frowned. That's your grand plan? She arched a brow. Do you have a better one? I didn't. A sharp beep cut through the tension. The ship's radar pulsed, a new signature appearing on the display. My gut went cold. Another ship had just dropped out of FTL, bigger than the first, heavily armed. I turned back to her. Still think we have time to run? She smiled, sharp and knowing. We'll make time. I wasn't sure if she was reckless, brilliant, or both. But right now, it didn't matter. I tapped the comm rays, prepped the jump drive. His voice crackled through the speaker. Coordinates? I didn't hesitate. Anywhere but here. The Vanguard jolted as the jump drive engaged, its worn systems straining against the sudden pull of faster-than-light travel. The ship shuddered violently, metal groaning in protest, but it held. The stars outside stretched into long, pale ribbons before vanishing entirely, swallowed by the abyss of hyperspace. For now, we had escaped. I exhaled and leaned against the bulkhead, muscles tight with lingering tension. The adrenaline had yet to wear off, the echoes of the last few minutes still running sharp through my veins. The executioners had come, just as she predicted, and we had survived barely. Reyes let out a heavy breath from the pilot's seat, fingers still hovering over the controls. Well, he muttered, that was unpleasant. I pushed off the wall and stepped forward. Damage. Minimal. They barely got a chance to fire before we jumped. But this rust bucket wasn't built for sudden exits. We might have fried half the systems forcing it. He ran a hand through his dark curls and scowled. And let's not forget we just pissed off the most powerful empire in the galaxy. I glanced at the woman standing near the viewport, watching the empty void beyond. The Dominion had sent its hunters for her. That meant she wasn't just a fugitive. She was a problem they wanted erased. I turned to her, started talking. She didn't move at first, as if considering whether I was worth the truth. Then, finally she met my gaze. What do you want to know? Everything. She crossed her arms. That's a broad request. I stepped closer. We nearly died back there. You knew they'd come for you. You knew exactly what they were. So you tell me, what did I just risk my life for? She studied me, her green eyes sharp, assessing. Then, with a slight nod, she spoke. My name is Celine Varen, last surviving heir to the Ikari's empire. Reyes let out a low whistle. Well, shit. I didn't flinch, but something in my chest tightened. Ikari's. A name from another era, a dynasty long thought dead. The Dominion had wiped them out years ago in a brutal annexation. Or so everyone believed. You're supposed to be extinct, I said. Celine smirked. And yet here I am. Reyes turned in his seat, brows raised. So what? You're here to reclaim your throne? Because I gotta tell you, lady, there's no throne left. Celine didn't react, her expression unreadable. No, there isn't. I frowned. Then why are they hunting you? She hesitated, and for the first time, I saw something beneath her composure, uncertainty. Because I exist, she said finally. Because the Dominion doesn't like loose ends. And because they know if the right people found out I was alive, it might remind them that the war isn't over. That I understood. The Dominion thrived on control. Even a rumor of rebellion was enough to make them kill. But this wasn't a rumor. It was flesh and blood standing in front of me. And what's your plan? I asked. Keep running? Hope they get tired of chasing you. Celine's lips pressed together. I had people once. Allies. We were supposed to meet on Eros Prime. Reyes scoffed. Eros Prime's a Dominion stronghold. Yes, she said, but it wasn't always. I knew what she meant. Eros had once been Ikari's territory before the Dominion took it, before they rebranded it as their own. I rubbed my jaw. So you think your people are still there? I don't know, she admitted. But if anyone's left, that's where they'll be. I turned to Reyes. How long to Eros? He looked at me like I'd grown a second head. You're actually considering this? She needs to know if she's got allies. If she doesn't, she's dead anyway. Celine's voice was calm. You don't have to take me. I studied her. She meant it. She wasn't pleading, wasn't bargaining. Just stating a fact. I sighed and turned back to Reyes. How long? He shook his head. 3 jumps, if the drive holds. I nodded. Then set the course. Celine watched me. Why are you helping me? I didn't have a good answer. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe, just maybe, I wanted to see what happened when a ghost of an empire walked back into the light. I met her gaze. Because you're not dead yet. That was enough. For now. The Vanguard rattled as it dropped from hyperspace, the sudden shift pulling the stars back into sharp pinpricks against the black. The engines whined in protest before settling into a low hum, the ship adjusting to normal space like a runner catching breath after a long sprint. Eros Prime loomed ahead, a sprawling planet of metal and stone, its surface veined with the cold glow of city lights. From this distance, it almost looked untouched, but I knew better. The Dominion had gutted this world, replacing its old heart with something colder, more controlled. What had once been the capital of the Ikari's empire now pulsed with the presence of those who had conquered it. Celine stood at the viewport, arms crossed, gaze locked on the planet below. She had said nothing since we set course. Now, as we drifted closer, her grip tightened on her forearm, nails pressing into skin. Not fear, not hesitation, something else. You sure about this? I asked. She didn't turn. No. That was the most honest answer she'd given me since I met her. Reyes let out a low whistle from the pilot's seat. Sensors are picking up heavy Dominion traffic. Orbital patrols, station hubs, defense satellites. Feels like flying into a wasp nest. We expected that, Celine said. Yeah, well, expecting it doesn't make it less stupid. Reyes muttered, but his hands moved over the controls, adjusting our approach. They'll scan us the moment we hit Opmo. How do you want to play this? Celine finally turned from the viewport. We need to get groundside without raising alarms. I arched a brow. You say that like it's easy. We won't be the first ship sneaking in, she said. There's a smuggler's lane on the night side, near the lower docking sectors. Dominion scanners are thinner there. Reyes snorted. Smugglers don't last long in Dominion space. The good ones do, she countered. That made him pause. Then, with a shake of his head, he keyed in new coordinates. Hope you're right, princess. The descent was rough. The smuggler's route, if that's what it had once been, was barely more than a decaying patch of space where Dominion oversight had worn thin. The turbulence hit like a hammer as we breached atmosphere, the ship shaking under the strain of reentry. Heat flared across the hull, sensors blaring in protest. Stay steady, I muttered, gripping the console. Reyes gritted his teeth. That's the plan. The Vanguard leveled out just as we hit cloud cover. Below, the city stretched in endless rows of steel and stone, its streets lit in a cold, artificial glow. The Dominion had reshaped this place in its own image, orderly, oppressive, efficient. Celine moved to the co-pilot's seat, scanning the displays. Head for the lower districts. There should be an abandoned port near the industrial sectors. You sound certain, I said. I'm not, she admitted, but it's our best shot. The docks came into view. Rusted platforms, flickering guidance lights, the skeletons of old freighters left to decay. It looked dead, but I had been to enough places like this to know that wasn't true. Reyes guided the ship into a slow descent. We're not alone down here. I saw it too. Figures moving in the shadows between the wreckage. Scavengers. Smugglers. People who survived in the cracks of Dominion rule. Think they'll be friendly? Reyes asked. Celine unbuckled her harness. No. The landing gear hissed as it locked into place. The engines wound down, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. I checked my weapon, then glanced at her. You expecting a fight? She met my gaze. Always. The hatch opened with a groan, cool night air rushing in, thick with the scent of metal and oil. The docks were silent, but not empty. I could feel the eyes watching from the dark. Celine stepped forward. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. This was her city once. Even in ruin, she walked it like she still belonged. A shape emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and broad, his face half hidden by a scarf. He stopped a few feet away, studying us with sharp, assessing eyes. Celine exhaled. Orion. The man pulled the scarf down, revealing a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. His eyes flicked between us before landing on her. You shouldn't be here. I didn't have a choice, she said. Orion glanced past her, toward the ship, then back. They're looking for you. I know. He let out a slow breath, then jerked his head toward the alleyway beyond the docks. Come on. If we're doing this, we don't have much time. I looked at Celine. This was the plan? She didn't answer. I sighed and followed. The corridors of the abandoned docking sector were narrow, choked with rust and decay. Orion led the way, moving with a quiet confidence that suggested familiarity rather than caution. Celine followed, just behind him, her gaze sharp, scanning the shadows as if expecting them to shift and strike. Reyes trailed to my side, one hand resting on his sidearm, the other clenched at his side. I kept my grip loose on my weapon, but my nerves were coiled. This place was too still, the kind of stillness that came before something broke. Orion stopped at a reinforced door tucked between the crumbling walls of an old storage facility. He pressed his palm against a scanner, and the door groaned open, revealing a dimly lit space beyond. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of metal and old circuitry. A command center of sorts, hastily assembled but functional. Monitors flickered with encrypted feeds, blueprints of Dominion patrol routes spread across a table in the center. Inside, a handful of figures straightened at our arrival. Some reached for weapons, others simply watched. Their expressions ranged from suspicion to disbelief. A woman with short, dark hair and an old military jacket stepped forward, arms crossed. You've got a damn nerve showing up here, Celine. Celine met her stare without flinching. Good to see you too, Mira. Mira exhaled sharply, shaking her head. The Dominion's been tearing through the lower districts looking for you. You should have stayed dead. I tried, Celine said dryly. Myra's gaze flicked to me and Reyes. And help, Celine said simply. Mira arched a brow. Since when do you take mercenaries? Celine didn't answer. I stepped forward. Since she needed a ship, I said, and a way to stay breathing. Myra's lips twitched like she wanted to argue, but couldn't. She turned back to Celine. Orion said you needed something. Celine nodded. I need to know who's still with us. A beat of silence. Then Mira sighed and motioned to the screens. We have people scattered, but not like before. The Dominion's been tightening its grip. Those who haven't been arrested or executed are in hiding. So try to fight. They didn't last long. Celine studied the map on the display. But there are still those willing to fight. Mira hesitated. Willing and able aren't the same thing. Celine's fingers drummed against the table. That's why I need to find them. We don't need an army. We just need to remind the Dominion that we exist. Mira let out a bitter laugh. You think one act of defiance is going to change anything? The Dominion wipes out rebellions before they begin. You know that better than anyone. Celine's jaw tightened. That's why we don't start a rebellion. Mira frowned. Then what exactly are you planning? Celine looked at Orion. Do we still have access to the Dominion network? He nodded slowly. Some. We've been using it to stay ahead of patrols. Then we don't fight them head on, Celine said. We make them fight each other. Mira stared. You want to turn them against themselves? Celine's expression was unreadable. They've spent years consolidating power. But the Dominion isn't as united as it looks. There are factions, rivalries. If we expose the right cracks, we don't need to start a war. They'll do it for us. Mira exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. You're insane. Maybe, Celine admitted. But we've tried everything else. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally Mira nodded. We have some intel. But if we do this, there's no turning back. Celine met my gaze. You still in? I didn't answer immediately. I had signed up for a job, not a revolution. But standing in this room, watching these people, I realized something. This wasn't about revenge. This was survival. And for the first time in a long time, I wanted to see what happened next. I smirked. I guess we make time. Celine nodded. And just like that, the war began.